is that given that we are providing both the Israelis and the Ukrainians with huge amounts of weaponry, and that we tend to privilege quality over quantity, which means we don't have endless numbers of different kinds of equipment. It's not surprising that the Pentagon believes that we're running down our own stocks to a dangerous level. I've argued that this is happening vis-a-vis East Asia and containing China for a long time. So I'm not surprised we're at this point. And I think that that's what's driving the train here. Well, in terms of a moral determination, this is clearly an administration that's incapable of making moral decisions. I mean, that's just out the window. Again, you always want to remember that we're supporting the genocide in Gaza. So
Right.
morality has nothing to do with this. And Trump would sell the Ukrainians down the river if he thought that was in his interest. So it has nothing to do with morality. I think there's no question that Trump is interested in sort of cutting off the Ukrainians if that can bring this war to an end. And this is one small step in that direction. But as you know, he's not been willing to take a giant step. And the real test is coming. The real test is what he will do once all of that material that's in the Biden pipeline runs out. Then he'll have to decide whether he's going to go to Congress and get permission to continue funding the Ukrainians or supplying them with weaponry.
For American withdrawal, drawback, or dialback, whatever term you prefer? No, absolutely not. They're having just as much difficulty as we are ramping up their industrial capacity to produce the weapons that Ukraine and Israel need. The reality is the United States hasn't been very successful at expanding its industrial base, and the Europeans have been even less successful, so they simply lack the weapons to provide. You should also remember that many of these European economies, this is especially true of Britain, France, and even Germany, are all struggling, spending enormous amounts of money to continue funding this war in Ukraine indefinitely, because this has become an endless war for the Europeans. I don't think it's politically viable. So they, meaning the Europeans, might be able to substitute for the United States if Trump cuts off support, but not for very long, in my opinion. I suppose we really have no way of knowing, unless you have inside sources. Professor Mayer at me as president. President Trump and President Putin discussed today. I have no idea what they discussed today. I think President Putin is playing a very shrewd game here. He's demonstrating that he's reasonable, that he's willing to speak with Trump, that he's willing to talk with Macron, and that he's interested in peace and so forth, while simultaneously continuing to wage the war as aggressively as possible against Ukraine. From Trump's perspective, he's essentially flailing around. It's classic Trump behavior. You should remember that Trump hasn't solved a single foreign policy problem that was on his desk when he entered the White House. He couldn't even defeat the Houthis after promising he would beat them. He wasn't able to defeat Iran, right? He can't end the war in Gaza in any meaningful way. He hasn't been able to end the war in Ukraine. So he's speaking with Putin, hoping that maybe they can work out some kind of agreement, but that won't happen because Trump isn't willing to make the concessions necessary to end this war. Have we ever settled the question about totally obliterated? I think it's been clearly established by people who operate with both feet firmly planted on the ground that we did not totally obliterate Iran's nuclear capabilities. Rafael Grossi, the head of the IAEA, has made it clear that it's just a matter of months before Iran resumes uranium enrichment. The Pentagon has stated that it could be as soon as a year from now that they're enriching uranium again. So the idea that this entire system has been obliterated, that the problem has been solved, and we can focus our attention on other fronts is not a serious argument. This problem remains unresolved. I'm going to play a clip for you that contains the most remarkable statement about where Iran stood prior to the president's bombing. This is Senator John Kennedy. Don't let his folksy manner of speaking fool you. He's very well educated, but the claims in this are absurd. I want you to pay attention to two parts of it. First, he mentions a briefing with intelligence officials where he and other senators received a briefing. He lists the briefer, listen for a name that's conspicuously absent. And then there's a very brief question and a 3-word answer at the end. The last 3 words you'll hear in this clip, and I want you to pay attention to that. Chris, play clip number 7. Before Israel and America took the action we did, Iran was within days of possessing a nuclear weapon. Now, within days. Within days. That's what we were told in this briefing. Within days. Sure, just to circle back and put a finer point on this, their proximity to getting a bomb seems to differ from what Tulsi Gabbard testified to in March. Was there a new assessment? Was that the Israeli assessment? Was that a new American assessment? Was that information new to you in this briefing? It was new to me. This was a good briefing. It was one of the best I've ever attended. I mean, Rubio, Haynes, Ratcliffe, General Kane, they didn't bring out a script and read carefully from it. They just looked us in the eye and spoke to us. The assessment stating that Iran was within days of having a bomb, is that an Israeli or American assessment? I don't know. Is that an Israeli or an American assessment? I don't know. Did you ask, Senator? Apparently not. What? Have you ever heard this nonsense before? Within days? Have you ever heard of a briefing with no notes, no charts, nothing written, just talking? Have you ever heard of a briefing where the chief United States briefer under federal law, called the Director of National Intelligence, in this case Tulsi Gabbard, wasn't there? Well, it's not surprising that Tulsi Gabbard wasn't there, because they don't trust her and they don't want her around to have to speak truthfully about exactly where the Iranian nuclear program stands, because she would definitely have to say that they are not a few days away from having a bomb. It's a ridiculous claim. It's just, it's hard to understand where we are as a country when you have important figures from the executive branch going before Congress and making these ridiculous claims. Everyone knows that it will take at least a year for the Iranians to build a bomb, right? The idea that they're days away is simply absurd, right? Regarding the end of the clip and the senator's comment that he didn't know whether it was Israeli or American intelligence, in a way, I don't blame him, because there's no difference. It's not like the United States is saying one thing and Israel is saying another. Certainly when you're dealing with people at the top, it's quite clear that Mossad, the leadership of Mossad and the leadership of the CIA, sing from the same hymn book. So obviously the senator, who has bought into what is the conventional wisdom on all these subjects and believes all these people just repeated what they had to say and had no interest in trying to figure out whether it was something the Americans believed or the Israelis believed. Again, it just doesn't matter. Is the director of Central Intelligence a Mossad asset? He's not a Mossad asset in the sense that he's a secret Mossad asset. He's a Mossad asset in the sense that he does Israel's bidding. The Israelis basically own him. It's very clear. Max Blumenthal has laid this all out for you on the show. Yes, Max calls him the Mossad stenographer. He takes down everything that they tell him. Yeah, that's exactly right. And it just emphasizes that at the higher levels, there's really no meaningful difference between Israeli views and American views on all these issues. By the way, I wouldn't be surprised if one of the reasons that Trump attacked on June 22nd was because he bought into this whole argument that the Iranians were a few days away from having a bomb, and it was imperative to destroy this capability before they acquired the bomb. And maybe that's why he attacked. He would have gotten that argument from the Mossad agents, according to Max Blumenthal, who visited him in the Oval Office. That may be true, but even so, he didn't have to talk to the Mossad agents. All he had to do was talk to John Ratcliffe, who, as you said, is effectively a Mossad agent, right? And it's not only Ratcliffe, it's people like Rubio who have bought into this. You should remember that Marco Rubio wants to be president someday. And he knows that if you want to be president someday, what you have to do is kowtow to Israel. Well, but Marco Rubio was born to parents who were not American citizens. And under Trump's interpretation of the 14th Amendment, he's not an American citizen. I'm being a little snarky, even though the statements I've made about this are true. How badly was the Israeli defense industry damaged by the retaliatory Iranian missiles? Do we know? No, we don't have any details. There's no question that a number of sites were hit. Air bases were hit. Research institutions were hit. They ran out of defensive missiles, or were running out of defensive missiles, as we know. So damage was done. And of course, damage was done to all sorts of buildings, both military buildings and civilian buildings inside Tel Aviv. And then in Haifa, they hit the port. They did enormous damage to one of the two oil refineries that the Israelis have. So the Iranians did an enormous amount of damage inside Israel, but there's no evidence that they eliminated any meaningful portion of Israel's defensive capabilities. Haaretz, which you and I read, reports that contrary to Israeli censors, it leaked out that 33,000 applications have been made for building reconstruction following the Iranian attack. Now, that wouldn't be a total, I'll use Trump's phrase, obliteration of buildings, but it would be material and substantial damage to the point where they're looking to the government for funds with which to reconstruct. Why would the Israelis drop a 500-pound bomb on an internet cafe in Gaza? Because they are in the process of committing genocide. And when a country is committing genocide, that's exactly what you would expect. This is not surprising. I mean, you read the news every day, you know what they're doing. Just think about the slaughter that's taking place at these various feeding sites that they've created, right? They're starving the Palestinians and forcing them to go to these collection points where they get food, and then when they arrive, they murder them. And given that this has been happening day after day, and somewhere between 50 and 100 Palestinians are being killed every day, I find it hardly surprising that they would drop a bomb on a cafe. It's all part of the genocide. Are you surprised that Israeli settlers in the West Bank are engaged in violence against the IDF? Israeli settlers fighting violently with guns against the Israeli military? No, not at all, because I think the Israeli military tries to impose some limits on what the settlers can do. Their ultimate goals are the same, the settlers and the IDF, but the IDF has certain rules that they believe apply to the settlers, but the settlers don't believe any rules apply to them, and they can do whatever they want. And many of them are extreme enough that they're willing to attack the IDF. So you have this ongoing problem in the West Bank where the settlers and the IDF are actually clashing, and the Israeli Defense Ministry is taking measures to try to resolve this problem. Why is Benjamin Netanyahu coming to Washington next week? We already give him everything he wants. Well, I would imagine that he wants to strategize with Trump. Trump thought that this whole operation was a one and done. He thought that he would go in there, or we would go in there, we would obliterate Iran's nuclear capability, and that would be the end of the story. But what Trump doesn't understand is he just bought into a forever war. This war is going to go on and on and on. I can lay out the details of how it's going to happen if you want, but the idea that this is one and done is not realistic. So what Netanyahu wants to do is brief Trump on how this is likely to play out, and he wants to begin working on getting him to ensure that the United States is in the fight with Israel. How do you think the war will progress? Israel will break the ceasefire as it always does whenever it enters into a ceasefire. And again, you need to understand what Israel's goals are here. Israel's goal is to destroy Iran, to turn Iran into another Syria, and at the same time, eliminate Iran's ability to enrich uranium. We focus a lot of attention on the fact that Iran can enrich uranium and that the Israelis and Americans want to prevent that, okay? But that's the first part of the story. The second part is that the Israelis are bent on destroying Iran. They don't just want regime change. Well, you said Ukraine, you meant Iran. Yes. I'm sorry, they want to destroy Iran, and it's going to take them a while to do that. It took them a while to destroy Syria. Of course, they did it with our help and with Turkey's help, and their belief is that they can destroy Iran, but they can only do it with our help. You should remember that one thing that's really happened here is that the Israelis have become extremely dependent on the United States to carry out these various military operations. The Israelis used to pride themselves on the fact that they had created the ability to operate independently against their principal adversaries. They didn't need another country to fight their wars for them. Yes, they would buy weaponry from countries in Europe or from the United States. They would take aid from those countries, but when it was time to fight, the Israelis would do the fighting themselves. That's no longer the case. And it's largely because the United States and Israel are joined at the hip. And because we're joined at the hip, they understand that anytime they go to war against a country like Iran, or when they execute a genocide in Gaza, they need the United States. They can't do it alone. And therefore, it makes perfect sense for Netanyahu to come to Washington to speak sweetly to Donald Trump, to stroke his ego and tell him how much Israel needs him, how much Israel appreciates him, and also just to give him a sense of what's coming. Because you need to understand, Judge, what's happened here is that they've not obliterated forever Iran's nuclear capability, and Iran is committed to, once again, enriching uranium, right? That means that we won't know what exactly they're doing because the IAEA, which has been our eyes and ears up to now, is no longer going to be able to monitor what the Iranians are doing. So the Israelis are going to tell all sorts of stories about how the Iranians are secretly enriching uranium for purposes of building a bomb. And we won't have Rafael Grossi or anyone like that there to say that they're not doing that. And the Israelis won't have Rafael Grossi to share secrets with or get secrets from. Yes, I fully understand that, but I'm also just telling you that you need to understand that from Israel's point of view, this is the ideal situation because the Israelis can portray the Iranians as moving rapidly toward acquiring nuclear weapons, and there will be no IAEA to inspect and say that's not the case. And once that rhetoric is on the table and it begins to spread in the United States, as it did just before the bombing on June 22nd, what will happen is that we will feel compelled to come to the aid of our close ally Israel. And of course, if we bomb again, that's not going to solve the problem. And all of this is a way of saying we're in another forever war. What has the United States of America as a country gained from its alliance with Israel? Nothing. As I've said to you before, Israel is a giant albatross around our neck, both strategically and morally. As a result of what's going on in Gaza, we're complicit in a genocide. And from a strategic point of view, we're now in another forever war, this one involving Iran. Furthermore, it's more likely than ever that Iran is going to get nuclear weapons. And if that happens, it's going to do enormous damage to the NPT. Furthermore, supporting Israel the way we support it has done great damage to the international legal system that we set up. Just look at what we're doing with the ICC, the ICJ, and so forth. So this is just terrible news for us. And as I like to emphasize, I know you're not happy to hear this. If you're interested in containing China, this is disastrous. You're depleting all sorts of military stockpiles in this war in the Middle East and, of course, in the Ukraine war as well. You're weakening yourself in East Asia, making it more difficult to contain China. So this is not good for us. What will China and Russia do, if anything, if the United States invades, whether by air, sea, or land? Iran. I don't think we're going to invade by land. I don't think that's in the cards. I think that the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese all understand that it's extremely likely, I'm choosing my words carefully here, that both the Israelis and the Americans will pay a return visit to Iran. And I think the Russians and the Chinese understand that they have a vested interest in helping Iran bolster its defenses and improve its inventory of ballistic missiles. I don't think the Russians and the Chinese want Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, but I do think that they would like to see Iran possess a highly potent ballistic missile force and also have air defenses that could shoot down Israeli aircraft and Israeli missiles as they attack Iran. Well, I don't know that Trump's going to have an easy time selling to the American people. Maybe he doesn't care since he can't run for election again. The concept of a major incursion, I'll use that word since it's not going to be a land invasion, into Iran. I mean, what did he gain by the $100 million he spent bombing? He gained nothing with a $500 million he spent bombing the Houthis.